Okay, so starting off with Peter's Bridge digital asset, we're going to basically construct the upper tier in this video. It's the surface that cars on a bridge would be driving across.
So the actual road.
Yeah, basically the road surface.
Okay, very good. Now, before we get started, what approach did Peter take in constructing the road?
For the road, Peter dropped down 2 line nodes to construct polygon lines, one for the width and one for the length of the bridge.
Okay.
He copied the width onto every point on the length, and used the curves and the points from that to construct a surface.
Okay.
He then took this surface and basically extruded it down to generate a 3D surface.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the basic direction that Peter took.
Okay, so in this video the idea is to get that set up.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's do it.
Awesome. So we're going to be working with SOP nodes down at surface level. So I'm going to drop a geometry node down here at object level. Jump inside and delete out the file so we can start constructing this network.
But first, let's go ahead and jump back up. Let's go ahead and name that
Sure.
geometry node bridge.
Yeah, that would really be useful. Just keep everything neat and tidy.
Yeah.
So first things first, I'm going to create a null, which is going to basically act as our location for all the custom parameters we're using whilst we're constructing the network. All the parameters we put on this null are going to become the parameters on our digital asset.
Okay.
So I'm going to drop down a null. And I'm going to rename this guy to master control.
So this is just going to serve as a temporary object to hold all of these different parameters.
It's just a nice location to have everything in the same place that we can easily add new parameters to and easily reference parameters from.
And just getting an idea of the big picture, at the very end, is it your intent to move all of these parameters over to the digital asset and delete out the master control node?
Yeah, at the very end we
Okay.
can do a big cleanup session, go through, find every reference to the master control, direct that directly to the digital asset,
Okay.
and then we can bypass the master control and delete it out.
So he doesn't serve as a middleman at that point.
Exactly. So
Okay.
it cleans up the network a little bit.
Sounds good.
Awesome. So if we right click on this guy, we can come to edit parameter interface, add a couple of spare channels, and we can drop out 2 float parameters. The first is going to be width. So this is the name of the attribute itself. This is the label that we'll see next to the attribute. If we move this over and apply, this is the label that we see here.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to lock the range so that that's too many decimal points.
So that it doesn't go below 0.001. You don't want them to hit 0.
Yeah, I just don't want to hit 0. And just for use on the slider, both here and since these settings will be taken over to our asset as well, for the width, it's nice to have a range between about 0 and 5.
Okay,
So
but you're not locking that. So
I'm not
if you want to
locking
go
it.
further,
You can use the
type it
value
in.
ladder, or you can type it in.
Exactly.
And we'll do a similar parameter here for the length.
And again, going back to the whole idea of locking it so that we can't go below 0.001 is we don't want a length or a width with a value of 0. That wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah. So you can get very, very small, but you can't get to 0.
Exactly.
So with those 2 guys set up, we can click accept. We now have 2 sliders that will let us set up our width and length, and we'll use those to drive some scaling on some lines once we've got the lines in place.
So let's go ahead and make a line.
Sweet. So the first line I'm going to drop down, if we tab over the network editor and not over the divider between them, is going to be a length line.
Bridge length. I like the sound of that.
Just bridge length.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Sweet. That's a cool name. If we
Is that in the end what it's going to represent?
It sure is.
Okay then.
It sure is. So if we bring our viewport down here, turn on display of points and point numbers, we can see this is a line that this node is creating. It's got 2 points due to the fact that the points is set to 2 up here, going from 0 to 1, and its direction is set in Y. Now I'm going to set up this bridge using positive Z for the length of the bridge and X for the width of the bridge.
Okay.
This is the approach that Peter took when he set up his bridge. So I'm going to change the direction of this guy. Instead of it going up in Y, I'm going to set the direction out to positive Z. I'm going to leave the distance and the points as they are. I'm going to use transforms to scale the length. This again is the approach Peter took.
Okay.
I like that approach. It keeps it separate from this node. It just keeps it in a separate place.
So you're going to go ahead and wire the output of this line right here over into a transform.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to do right now.
All right.
So if we right click on here and drop down a transform and bring our visibility down, we're going to work with scale in Z.
Okay.
And we're basically going to take our length parameter we just set up here. And if we copy this guy and come back over to the transform, which I will rename shortly, we can right click and paste copied relative references. Now what this will do, it basically references the channel, but it references it using relative referencing rather than having the complete directory structure. This is very important when setting up a digital asset. It's very important that everything is internal to the asset, so that if you were to change the name of the asset at the top level or move things around at the top level, everything inside doesn't explode.
Exactly.
So since we're referencing, what this basically does, it works like a Linux directory structure. If you use // you basically jump up to the file above, which in this case is bridge, that contains these guys. We then use /master control to point at master control, which is inside bridge, and then /length to point at the length parameter that is on the master control null. So with that in place, this parameter is directly controlling the scale in Z, so that's now controlling the length of this line. And we can set up an identical line. Let's rename this guy to
something like length scale.
Yeah, I like the name of that.
Okay.
So we can do the exact same thing with a width line. So we drop a new line in place and rename this guy to bridge width to keep in with original naming convention, as I failed to type width there. It's good stuff. So again, this guy by default is up in Y. We're going to use X as our direction. But I'm going to offset the origin slightly in X so that he's actually straddling the origin.
Okay.
So he's half on one side, half on the other. We know our distance is 1. So if we take half of that distance and minus that, so minus 0.5, that will move him over to the origin. Since when we transform and we scale, and we scale with our pivot on the origin, it'll basically mean that we scale up even amounts both sides. So he's always the center point is always going to be on the origin.
Exactly. Okay.
So if we wire not everybody node, let me select just the one node, Houdini being funky for a minute, and drop that into a transform. And again, just as we did before, we can take our width parameter and copy that, and we can paste that down on our scale in X as a relative reference.
Okay.
And now if we change our width,
Very
that
nice.
changes too. So we've let's rename this to width scale. So we have our two curves set up, and we can use a copy SOP to copy our width curve onto every point along the length curve. Now currently,
we've only got 2
We've
points.
only got the 2 points. Later on, in one of the later videos, we're going to actually come and divide these up. There are a number of reasons these lines will be divided up, and I'll explain that as we come to the areas. For now, though, we're only going to have 2 points. So we're going to get a copy of the width curve along here, and a copy of the width curve along here. But that is plenty to create a surface from.
Okay.
So I'm going to drop down a new copy SOP. And if we middle mouse button on these inputs, we can see what it's requiring, what it expects to go into each input. This is the primitives to copy. We're going to be copying our width curve. And we can use a template curve to copy too. That's going to be our length curve. So I'm actually going to grab these and rearrange them just to keep things as neat as possible. And drop the width curve into the primitives we want to copy. Drop our length curve down into here. If we bring our visibility over to the copy, we can now see we have a copy up this end and another copy up this end. Rename this guy to something sensible. Probably to width length copy.
Sounds good. Sounds creative.
Yeah, I really spent ages thinking about that name. So we've got enough detail here to actually skin a surface, and skin is the appropriate word because that's the name of the node we're going to be using to generate this. So if we wire this guy into a skin node, which I will call skin tierSurface, and bring our visibility down, and also there we go. His specular highlight was deceiving me there.
Oh, I got you.
I thought shading was on, and wasn't on, sorry. Press space W to turn shading on, but shading was already on, it turned shading off. It was just a specular highlight was making it perfect colour with the background of the view.
I got you. Go ahead and kill out the grid as well.
That will really help clear things up, and we can turn off points and point numbers there. So this is the surface we've just skinned. Going between these two curves
Okay.
has created a...
Now, at the beginning of this video, you said that after skinning this, the next thing you were going to do was extrude it down.
That's very true.
So is that what you're about to do?
Yeah. When we're extruding down, we're going to. I want to be able to control basically the thickness, the depth of the extrusion.
Tier itself. Okay.
And so it makes sense to quickly go and add a new parameter to our master control node before going and extruding. So I'm actually going to drag this down to nearer where we're working. And we can edit our parameter interface and drag out a new float, which I will call tier thickness. And the range for this guy I will set to ranging up to 0.5. We don't want it to go too thick, but you can make that go above, because I'm not going to lock the maximum, I'm just locking the minimum, so again we can't go to 0.
Okay.
So if we accept that, and
so now we can go
I will copy this parameter, we're going to need it in a minute.
Ready. Okay.
I'm getting ready, so I don't have to jump back.
Go ahead and do a poly extrude now off of the skin tier surface node.
So we've got a poly extrude node.
Right.
We can drop down. It's going to look crazy for a minute. Why? Because our translate Z, which is basically our extrude depth, is set to 0. So now we've got two surfaces on top of each other. That's going to cause some issues with shading. But if we come down here to paste in our relative reference.
Okay.
So now what we've set up, we've got basically our top surface is being extruded away from the original surface upwards based on our tier thickness, and we're being left with an empty gap at the bottom there. But if we were to come over to our options tab, we can check to output the back, and that does then output both the top surface and the bottom surface.
Okay.
I'm gonna jump back to our master control. As we change the tier thickness, it's gonna change basically the extrusion depth.
Okay.
The local Z translate on the extrusion, which is the depth. So there's Z. And I will rename this extrusion to tier extrude, just to keep things neat and tidy. And currently we can see this surface, this basically what is nothing more than a box right now, has smooth shading. Basically what's happening is the edges are getting basically smoothed in such a way that it's shaded in dark on the back, and it's being fully shaded on the front, and the shading is being smoothed between that, such that we get this really weird shading effect. What we need to do, basically can use a cusp polygons, I think it's an edge cusp node, and that will, we'll see what that will do. It basically will give these faceted faces, it will have hard shading, and it basically does that by giving you a unique point on each corner for each face. If we turn on the points currently, we just have one point in the corner being shared between the three faces. If we drop this down into an edge cusp node, we can see that we get extra points at each corner, but it does give us hard shading, which looks much nicer.
Okay.
So let's call this tier cusp. Now, the ability to cusp surfaces is also available over on the facet node. This is basically just like one part of the facet node's functionality, but since that's all we're going to use, it makes sense just to use the edge cusp node instead. Okay. So we actually had everything in place now that we set out to create, but so if we were to change the width of our bridge updates, let's turn off points for a minute. The length has exploded. This happens quite often. All that it normally requires you to do is find what's being controlled by length, push enter in there. It seems to be a bug with Houdini. And now length picks right back up. It's a little bit frustrating, but as long as you know, if things break, if parameters break that are driving other parameters, normally the solution I find is to go in, find where they're being controlled, simply enter on your expression. Mm-hmm. Things usually fix themselves from that.
Of course, I'd like to remind everyone that we are still working with a beta version.
It is very true.
Houdini, so keep that in mind.
And our tier thickness as well, working
very nice.
there. Now, something that Peter did that I thought was very cool in his network was the ability to control the width based as a ratio of the length. And the way he did this is first we'll create some extra parameters up on our null. We'll create a toggle that basically lets us choose, are we going to use our width or are we going to use a length ratio?
Okay.
And I'll just call this guy ratio. And he also had another floating point that's going to be basically the ratio value. And again, we'll lock that to so it can't go right to 0, and I'll leave that as 2, but unlocked so that we have full range of control if we wish to. And the great thing you can do with parameters, you can set up a rule such that they are disabled in certain cases. We've got this ratio checkbox, so when the ratio checkbox is on, we want to use this parameter and we don't want to use the width. When it's off, we want to toggle that, we want to use the opposite. So when the ratio is off, when it's set to 0, we want this guy to be disabled. So if we type in that, basically the rule is going to be when ratio, the parameter ratio we've just created, is equal to 0, this guy is going to be disabled. But back up on this width, it's going to be when ratio is equal to 1 that he'll be disabled. And finally, down here on the ratio checkbox, just to make things a little bit neater in terms of the way the parameters are laid out, we can check horizontally join to next parameter, and what that would do if we click apply, it gives us our ratio checkbox on the same line as our width length. It's nice to have that on the same line because they totally relate to each other. So when this guy is unchecked, we're using the width checkbox, and when he's checked, we're using this width to length ratio. So now we need to set this up to accept so that we can have a way of controlling our width based on this. And this comes back to what I was saying about using transforms. Transforms are going to be very helpful here because of the fact that we can basically branch off and use a different transform, and then we're going to be able to switch between them based on what our toggle is set to.
Okay.
So what I'll do, I'll take our bridge width, and excuse me while I grab some water. So I'll take our bridge width and our middle mouse button on the output of this guy so that we can branch off with a separate transform. So rather than inserting between, we're branching off with a new one. And I'll call this width ratio, or even ratio scale. That's probably a better name. And when we're using ratio scale rather than width scale, we're going to, again, scale in X for our width, but we're going to scale based on, I'll grab the first parameter to speed this up, it's going to be our length. And I'm going to push E to bring up an expression editor just to make it easier to see what we're typing in. So we're going to take our length, we're going to multiply the length by our ratio value that we had set up. I believe we called it width length ratio. And what that will do is basically use the ratio floating point value multiplied by the length such that as we increase the ratio, the width will get bigger, but if we were to increase the length, the width would also get bigger because we're using basically a proportion of our length as our width. So if we multiply this in by, so we're referencing another channel, and as before, let's keep this relative. So jump up and grab our master control, and we're going to use the parameter we just set up, which was width length ratio, and accept that. So right now I'm looking at the curve the line that we've just scaled with that branch, and if we were to change this ratio down, he changes, but if we were to change the length as well, he's also changing up there, so it's working exactly how we need. So now we've got two possible lines that we'd want to use in this copy, and we basically need to switch between them based on our ratio toggle up here. So let's wire a switch node in between our width scale and our copy, and we can do that by right-clicking on the output. Right-clicking will insert a node between the output of that node and whichever node it wired into. So we can insert a switch in between these two guys, and I'm actually going to flick these over. It'll make sense why in a minute. I want our ratio scale to be our second input, our original width scale to be our first input, because when the toggle is off, the toggle's value is 0, and when the toggle's off, I want to use this guy. When the toggle's on, the toggle value is 1, and we want to use this guy, so we can simply use the value of the toggle as our select input. So if we wire these into the switch and bring our visibility down to the switch, when we're set to 0 on this select input, we're looking at this width scale. When we toggle over to 1, we're going to look at this branch of the network coming in. So we can set this up to our master control ratio, And what that will let us do is flick between...
Adjust one of them so they can see a larger difference.
The ratio is now set up huge. So when we're using ratio, we're controlling ratio, we're using the ratio curve here at the switch. Uncheck, we're now using the width. And that will follow through all the way down through our copy, through our skin and extrude, and our edge cusp, such that we're currently using our width. But if we were to check ratio, we're now using our ratio. And that was everything that I'd like to cover in this lesson.
Okay,
So thank you very much.